So happy to be here, and I'm so happy to see all of you in the crowd. We actually started our conversation 5 minutes earlier, and I hope we can continue in the same tone of banter. It's going to be a lot of fun. I'm really excited to be here, of course, as my bio mentions, and I wear it proudly as a badge. Love crime fiction, particularly Golden Age crime fiction. So super happy to be in discussion with these two. Absolutely love their work. So we'll go ahead and get started. We're in for a good surprise today. So first of all, kind of just getting right into it. I mean, we know crime fiction has universal appeal. And having read both of your work, both of you have had, persistent like nods to Golden Age crime fiction, a lot of things we love, a lot of the tropes that we really enjoy. I'd like to hear from each of you on what you think is this, gory appeal of crime fiction, and perhaps a little bit of, how you've incorporated Golden Age crime fiction nods to it in your work. So maybe, Chris, would you like to go first?
Of course, thank you. Wonderful introduction, and lovely to be here on the last day of JLF. See so many smiling faces in the audience. The question was on the form of the murder mystery and the tropes. Yes. Something I find fascinating about murder mysteries is that there's a detective at the center of the novel, and the detective is detecting the crime, the central crime. And so the process of the story, they're moving inward. It's this process of negation. It's not this, it's not this, it's not that. And this is the scientific process, but it's also quite a spiritual process. We're moving inward when we're writing towards the central question in the novel. And so the main character, Ewan, in my story, is a war veteran, and he's experienced an incredible amount of trauma. He's lost his sister. And as a result of this, he clings to this idea of certainty and rigidity, the fact that he can kind of control the world and exert his will over it. And so over the course of the novel, he's presented with challenges to that idea, and that's his inward journey towards releasing that trauma. So I thought using the form of the murder mystery, where we're moving inward towards the crime, paralleled that inward journey. Yeah.
Wonderful, and actually very delightfully you do reference like Chesterton as a peer because of the period you've set in, and I was just very delighted by all the little puzzles and things that you worked into it. So thank you so much for that. And perhaps a little from Arjun, because I know you have lots on this as well.
Well, I love that Chris used the words murder mystery. I don't think of myself as a writer of crime fiction. I think of myself primarily as a writer of historical fiction, and after that, as a writer of mysteries. And I think my mom would say that I like murder mysteries because I have innate criminal tendencies. But she's a Punjabi mother, and you know how they are. But the real reason I think Golden Age mysteries work is because they are incredibly imaginative. And I think imagination, I think stories without imagination can be quite tedious and tiresome. The first sentence from The Rape of the Lock is, "'Tis hard to say if greater want of skill is seen in writing or judging ill, but of the two, less tiresome it is to waste one's time than mislead one's sense." Sorry, I think I mangled that a bit, so I apologize. But what I'm trying to say is Golden Age mysteries are wonderful. They're wonderful because they are pure storytelling.
Yeah, perfect. And I don't know if you think this too, Hemangini, but the mystery it's a participatory dynamic.
Absolutely.
There's the question, which is what storytelling is all about, interacting and finding the question together.
And I think what it does is, it's some of the characters, the characterization is wonderfully imaginative. And I'm not talking about Sherlock Holmes. I'm not talking about, Hercule Poirot. There's a writer called Ernest Brahma, who is a German writer of Golden Age mystery. His character's blind, and to tie in with what you've written about, he solves mysteries entirely through smell.
Wonderful, wonderful.
And I think there's a timelessness to the storytelling. So for me, my character is a Sikh Maharaja who solves mysteries. And he does this between 1900 and 1915, what's called the era of fin de siècle, before the Great War, right? Now, I set out to create this character for 3 reasons. The first reason was I wanted to reverse the gaze. I talked about this in the previous session as well. There's a great sparsity of of heroes of Indian origin in Raj fiction. The heroes are always white. The Indian is always Gangadeen, the person who fetches the water, the bishti, the ghodewala, the devious guy. The Maharaja is the devious guy who's plotting to undermine the Raj. But these were amongst the best educated and wealthiest people in the world. They were Jagatjit Singh of Kapurthala, Bhupinder Singh of Patiala, Jayaji Rao Scindia. These were all the Rajput families. These were people who were refined, who were educated, who were the best traveled people in the world. So it was exciting for me to try and create this character who interacts with the English, but on the same level. But in spite of that, he remains an outsider. So it's a social commentary at heart. So my work, like I said, is about the history. Sorry,
Yeah.
Chris, I'm going on a bit.
No, not at all. In fact, I have a follow-up question.
But
and
the
then I'll come
only
back
way
to
I
Chris
could
as well.
package the history was by coupling it with mystery. And it's a wonderfully exciting genre. And I think I was the second Indian writer to start doing that. There's a wonderful writer called Madhulika Lidl who has a character called Muzaffar Jung, who's a Mughal detective. But in the West, it's a very, very exciting subgenre of crime fiction, historical mystery.
Yes,
So I'll
absolutely.
pass it back to you.
Absolutely, not at all. In just a moment, I'd like you to add on about Charan Singh, because you already talked about Sikandar, and I know Charan Singh is very significant in your series as well. Tell us a little about how you came about with this character, and then we'll come back to Chris and hear some interesting things.
Well, that's my grandfather's name. My grandfather was a lieutenant colonel in the Indian Army. He fought with the Guides. He was injured in Indochina. He drank a lot. He had a Bentley. He was 6'3". I'm the short one in the family. Very handsome, very dapper, suits from Bond Street. What we call a brown sahib to the core. And that man saw more in his life than I think the 4 generations that follow us will see. He survived World War I, he survived World War II, survived partition. But Charan Singh is the real hero of so my characters are Sikandar Singh. Maharaja Sikandar Singh is the Sherlock Holmes, and Charan Singh, who's his manservant, is Watson. But Charan Singh is more fun than Sikandar because all he does is sort of quip, and he's old and he's seen it all, and he cracks jokes about this rather too intelligent Maharaja.
And he has a lot of children.
Yes, he has many children who he doesn't tell anyone about.
It's how he gets himself out of a scrape.
Lots and lots
he
of
tells his
scrapes.
child.
It's a very Sardar thing or Rajasthani thing. We have family everywhere. I was in London 4 months ago and I had 37 kilos of overweight baggage. And I was in Heathrow and I ran into a cousin, some Masi's nephew's husband who was behind the counter. And I haven't been that happy, not when any of my books have come out, because I did not have to pay for 37 kilos of overweight baggage.
So excellent. Thank you so much for that. Now, Chris, I really want to get into the Hebridean hillside and the atmosphere and the setting for your book. I actually found out a little more about this after I read your book. And I really love the fact that there have been disappearances in history. There are these Stonehenge-like formations, possibly linked to practices of occult, and it just builds this really nice setting. So I'd love to hear from you why you picked this. I know you lived close, and I wanted to hear your perspective on why you picked this area, and also dive in a little bit on the Furnival Mansion, because that was absolutely fascinating to me.
Yeah, thank you. So I actually stayed on an island in the Hebrides called Egg on the west coast of Scotland while I was formulating the plot of the novel. And for those who haven't been, it's this grand, mystical, strange, terrifying, sublime landscape, which after a while, when you're living there, and you don't have any internet connection, any distractions, you feel that it starts to speak to you in a way. It becomes alive, and maybe, you mentioned the Pictish stones, these wonderful carvings, which nobody really knows what the symbols mean, but when you're there, you can feel their significance. I think that's inspired by the landscape. They were feeling maybe the spirit in the land and wanted to convey that through symbols. But I think I was doing something similar when I was writing the story. The symbolic idea of an island. When you're writing in this genre, if you believe in genre, I think islands tend to be where mysteries are set or crime novels are set, because an island is on the edge of society. People go there to often escape or to contend with some inner turmoil. And so, the island is a place where questions arise about what we deem correct as a society. What do we reward and what do we punish? So that, combined with the grandeur of the landscape, was just this perfect setting for the lost author. And you mentioned the island and the manor on the island. So this is an interesting story. So I visited Egg, and then I wrote the novel. Okay, I borrowed the mansion where all of the kind of misdemeanors take place in the story from the neighboring island called Rum. Okay, but I hadn't visited Rum. I just, looked at pictures of the castle. It's called Kinloch Castle, and it was built in the Victorian era. It's kind of it's like an effigy to excess. It's got all these wild sculptures within it, but when I finished the novel, I thought, well, I'd better visit Rum, and I'd better say hello to Kinloch Castle. And the strangest thing is I went there, and I saw CB was engraved on the manor in this massive writing, and CB is my initials, and my friends, we were looking at each other thinking, okay, let's just walk away from that. But yeah, so I think the manor is sort of a reflection of the main character's unconscious, and I don't want to reveal too much there, but within the story, the manor starts to communicate with the main character, Ewan.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, I live in a very different island. Nothing eerie about it. I live in Singapore, so I'm always, and I love.
It's incredibly eerie.
I love that. But I always crave this kind of atmosphere, and I think. I wanted to ask you about the chess sets in the Furnival Mansion, because I thought that bit was just so interesting, because every time he would go by and the chess sets and the pieces would have moved. So, of course, just building into the atmosphere, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, with mysteries, there's this sort of cat and mouse game. The main character is seeking an answer, and they are receiving, input from various different characters, and those characters are somewhere in the distance, and we don't quite know who they are. So there's this chess set within the manor, which is throughout the course of the novel changing, and Ewan is trying to discover who might be changing it, if it's anyone at all, or if it's all in his own mind. Yeah.
Wonderful, wonderful. So the other piece, I cannot not ask this question. I wanted to talk about the women in your stories. I, of course, wrote a book only with women. One might say I was biased against the men in the stories. But I know you have some spectacular women characters in your books as well. And, although your protagonists are male, I'd love to hear about their influences. So maybe we'll start with Arjun and hear a little bit from you, and then move to Chris.
Well, I was told by a dear friend that every single book that I've ever written has failed the Bechdel test. So,
what was your reaction to this?
My reaction, as I tried to point out, and she was very irate. She's very tiny, and she's a talented writer. I won't name her. But she was very angry that so the Bechdel test is a test. Alison Bechdel is a graphic novelist from America who said that if you have a certain number of scenes where women speak or interact without talking about men
Yeah.
in any
Yeah,
way.
that's right.
That's the Bechdel test, and that can be called a truly feminist piece of writing. And I pointed out to my friend that unfortunately, the women of the Raj, in particular, were relegated to, and particularly Indian women, were relegated to an invisible role. And particularly in Royal India, which most of Royal India, as we know, practiced parda. The zenana, the inner sanctum of the palace was where the women were kept. But at the same time, these incredible women, and the example I always give of incredible women and incredible Indian women is a lady called Jahanara. She was Aurangzeb's sister. She designed Chandni Chowk. She wrote some of the most wonderful Sufi poetry you'll ever read. She is also in part responsible for why the English came to occupy India rather than the Portuguese. But Jahanara, after her entire life, she's also responsible for mangoes in India, which is a lovely story in itself. But she was buried in a pauper's grave next to her guru, who was, Nizamuddin Aulia in Delhi even today. You go there, you'll see people coming to Nizamuddin and eating kebabs while standing on her grave. And that perfectly encapsulates the story of Indian women until about 15 or 20 years ago. Now, my new book, the one which just came out, Missing Memsahib, is about that. There's a wonderful term, I had mentioned a term to you backstage, adventurers, who were sort of Westerners who came to India to make their fortune. But the phrase, the word I really love is adventuress. So between 1857 and 1920, there was a class of English women or European women who came to India looking for a husband so that she could make a fortune. And a very good example of this is William Makepeace Thackeray in Vanity Fair talks about the Indian adventuress. And there was a phenomenon called the fishing fleet. So the fishing fleet was basically, the churches would receive letters from soldiers and planters and guys in Mufassal towns who were one Englishman to 8,000 Indians who would write to his priest in Pitlochry or Kinloch or Perth saying that, can you find me a wife? And he'd find an orphan girl or someone's bastard child, and say that, would you like to go to India and marry this man? And the church would pay for their tickets, and they would come out to India, and they would either land at Madras, Calcutta, or Bombay. But the moment the ships arrived at the horizon, all the Englishmen would dash to the docks because it was first come, first serve. The guy who got there first got to pick the best looking wife or the prettiest wife, and it was a business, and they were called the fishing fleet. And a lot of these women would end up being rejected. And there's a case in point in my new book where a very attractive woman is rejected by her husband because she's 6'1" and he's 5'5". So he doesn't want to be known as Mr. Too Tall's husband, like that. So she ends up saying, I'm going to make my own life. And for me, that I feel is the spirit of feminism before it was actually quantified.
That said, I know you have a character called Helen in there. And she does show significant spunk, and she's kind of involved in things. And I was just interested in, I don't know if this is the last in your series, but she could potentially take on quite a bit because she's already helping out quite a bit. So I wonder if there could be something that she could...
It could be the last in the series. It depends on how many people buy the books.
So
maybe if everyone here bought 10 copies each, we can see another one.
Then you'd write a feminist version of the next one. All right, wonderful. And of course, Chris, I'd love to hear from you. I know there are some significant female characters in your book, you and sister, and of course many others. Please go ahead.
Yeah. So what I found quite interesting when I was reading your book, Arjun, is that you mentioned Heloise and Abelard, which is also a key part of my story. Heloise and Abelard were this medieval couple, okay, and Abelard was Heloise's tutor. and he was known as this great man of intellect. He knew so much, and he had stamped his place on this world as this, preeminent thinker, scientist. His relationship with Heloise, she's bringing out this other side of him, this intuitive side. And funnily enough, Abelard's last words were, "I don't know." And I think there's something about that, that drive, and I'm speaking stereotypically, but drive in the masculine to conquer, to forge an identity, to stamp your mark on the world. And my epigraph in my story is a quote by Jorge Luis Borges, which goes, "When writers die, they become books, which is after all not too bad an incarnation." And so I think, why do we want to become books? What's that urge? And Anwin, who is Malcolm's wife, Malcolm is this fantastic mystery novelist who stamped his mark on the world in my story. And his wife, Anwin, is a concert violinist. And towards the end of the story, Malcolm turns to her and he says, "You're the better artist, because you paint with time." There's something about that ephemeral beauty which is even more significant than the kind of brash stamping my mark on this place. This is mine, climbing Everest and planting your flag and saying, "I climbed the bastard," or whatever it is. You bow to the mountain.
So that's really wonderful. And you mentioned time, so I'm going to pick up on that because I have a question I really want you to get into with regards to time. It's very significant to your book. So I know you've spent some time, even before you wrote this novel, kind of studying time, and when we were chatting earlier, quantum physics came into it, so this promises to be interesting, of course. Tell us a little bit about that. Tell us about your interest in this and how it came into the book.
So, I'm fascinated with the idea of time, and I always have been, and often when you speak to people about time, they look here, okay? But there is a difference between absolute time, this thing which we can measure, and the experience of time. And I think I mentioned Borges. Borges is a fantastic writer who writes about the nature of experience, time as something experienced. So in the world of science, we call this phenomenology, looking at the nature of experience. And as a writer, this is fascinating to me. How do we bring these concepts within physics and science to the emotional? Yeah. And Borges is a writer who does that. And it's something which I've attempted to do in The Man on the Endless Stair. Like I said, Ewan has this rigid, deterministic approach to the world. He believes that the world can be described through equations. But over the course of the novel, he kind of relinquishes that worldview and surrenders to uncertainty. The way that you describe the wavelength of red light is very different to the experience of a sunset. Okay, and we intuitively understand that. And this is an idea which has been discussed in spirituality for a while, but it's also now at the frontier of physics, quantum physics, particularly the interpretation cubism, quantum Bayesianism, and I'm collaborating with the proponent of cubism, a guy called Professor Chris Fuchs, in communicating these ideas, because how do you communicate these equations? You use language, and so we need to, as writers, embrace that. You convey cognitive processes through language. So let's write more stories about science.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I was so impressed with this. He shared an anecdote with me about how you had this interest in it, you wrote your paper, and this wasn't your area of study to begin with. And so that's really wonderful. I'd like to hear from you. I know I have an eye on the clock because we're talking about time, and I do have an eye on the clock, and I want some time for questions. But I do want Arjun to really get into the criminology in the Maharaja series, because this was a favorite thing for me as well. And I know there are CSI junkies out there in the crowd who want to hear about this. I think it's really challenging to bring this to historical fiction and kind of, make it as engaging, because, and really studying the technology and the things that they would use from so long ago. So tell us a little about that.
Well, I'm not really an Anglophile, I'm a Francophile. I'm very intrigued by Europe and the continent, particularly, between 1880 and 1920. And one of the things that we often don't hear about or read about is how there was this, take the word psychology. It didn't exist at that time. The study of the mind was something which was just beginning to start to take form. And the study of the criminal mind in particular was something which was, it was almost like a form of arcana. In fact, criminology was part of the occult. And I find it hilarious. Aleister Crowley was a consultant for the King's Bench when it came to why people murdered people. And there are two characters in particular. A gentleman called Eugene Vidocq, who was a criminal who turned into a cop, and he's the character on whom Poirot, Holmes, there's a wonderful French detective called Auguste Dupont. They're all based on the same person. And he was the first person to use logic, and it's hilarious to see that what they call logic is what we now call common sense. So to use common sense to solve murders. But at the same time, he had a rival, and the rival was an Italian guy called Cesare Lombroso. And Lombroso at the University of Turin had this entire thing about, so the key difference is that Vidocq said criminals are made, Lombroso said criminals are born. And for me, that in itself, these things that we take for granted today, and yes, CSI is a big part of it. CSI is sort of commodified how criminology works. But that actually brings me back to your first question and the words that Chris used so eloquently, murder mystery, It's about whodunits, right? We write whodunits. That has changed radically now, and particularly with Nordic crime fiction, it's become about the psychology of the criminal.
Why done it?
Why done it? Exactly.
Exactly right.
Or how done it, in some cases.
Yeah.
But, I'll give you an example. My favorite historical mystery is neither a mystery nor a crime novel. It's The Name of the Rose by Umberto Eco. Fabulous book, decent movie, Sean Connery at his worst. But, it's the same, the idea of using intelligence to unlock a puzzle. It's something that appeals to all of us. Whether you do Sudoku or a crossword, or you're trying to figure out how you went wrong when you fight with your wife, the mysteries are all the same. It's just the techniques that you use to get to the answer, to unlock the Gordian knot, I think.
What's interesting is that the way that they unlock the Gordian knot is they slice through it with a sword.
At the end, which is what most Indians do anyway at one point. So, yeah. Yes, so that's my fascination for criminology comes from there.
Absolutely love that. I know we have about 13 minutes. I'd like to open the floor for some questions so that we can get as many as we can. And then I have a concluding question if we have time for it. So, yes. Could we have the mics, please?
My question is regarding the writing process, especially when it comes to crime fiction. I want to know from both of you, what is your writing process? Do you have all the clues, red herrings, suspects, the motive, everything outlined right at the beginning, or in the flow when you write, you change and you add on things? Very curious to know about that.
That's a fascinating question, and it varies writer to writer, so I'd be interested to hear Arjun's approach. The way that I conceive of the approach of writing is it's a scale, and on one end of the scale is a gardener, someone who is cultivating the story over time, perhaps doesn't plan so much, but allows it to grow and change and adapt with it. And in that way, you can encounter things which are surprising. And I think that kind of natural approach leads to really beautiful outcomes. And then on the other end, there's the architect, someone who very meticulously plans the story from start to end. And when you're writing a sort of a puzzle box murder mystery, I think this approach is more useful. But, you know, matter of perspective, I would place myself somewhere in the middle of that, in that I will have chapter by chapter breakdowns, but just a paragraph, and then I'll allow myself to encounter new experiences and uncertainty along the way.
I think, yes, I think gardeners and writers of fiction certainly share one quality, a monomania. There's a certain madness which comes in. To answer your question, I think you can romanticize the approach to it. You can create wonderful worlds if that works for you. Most likely, I spent the first 20 years of my writing life doing exactly that. I wrote 9 novels that I was told that they're good, but they're too long, there's too much English, you know, can you contemporize it? I started writing mystery because I was 40 and I wanted to get published. And this character came to me one day. I was at an exhibition of Maharaja Jagatjit Singh's cigarette cases, but he was Sikh and he's not allowed to smoke. It's anathema. But he liked cigarette cases. He had Cartier make these wonderful cases, and he owned like 7,000 of them. They're now at the National Gallery in England as well. But I decided to change my approach to writing. So now what I do is I write an outline. I write an exhaustive outline where I try to break down whatever I can. Then I also write out of sync. I don't go chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3. I write whatever I can, whenever I can. I do a lot of writing in the bathroom. I still have a BlackBerry. I don't take calls on it, but I write on it. And I find it very useful. It's actually like sort of Dalton Trumbo in his bathtub. I have my little writing space. And I make it up as I go along. And to simplify the process, you go off in 8,000 or 9,000 directions, and you feel frustrated and inundated and confused and lost, and then one day you finish the book. The key is you come to it every day. You put in the time, because writing, I'm sorry, Chris, I know you're going to disagree with me here. Writing is not an art. It's a craft. The more time you spend doing it, the better you'll get at it.
Can it be both?
Yes, it can. Well said. I also genuinely think you can write a masterpiece using whatever process you want. When it goes to the editor or the publisher, all that goes out of the window. So the writing, unfortunately, in India, is the easy part.
So on that note, I'm going to quickly butt in because I see a few hands up in the crowd. Could we get mics, the boy in the third row?
So in many crime fiction, there are characters who are so innocent. So my question is innocence a crime?
Wow, that's a great question. So there are lots of innocent characters in the story, and is innocence a crime? Beautiful. We were speaking about art, and I think the artist is someone who is innocent. You know, this spirit of wonder, I think, is so important, particularly as writers, to cultivate that sense of recognizing something and then appreciating it, not just going to the appearance, but really understanding what it is, taking that pause to appreciate. And it's a shame, I feel, that we're in a world where that mindset is maybe not as prevalent as it might once have been. You know, you could speak for hours about the reasons for that. But yeah, I mean, in mystery novels, you see innocent people suffering all the time. But this is a theme in literature, you know, and in a way, it's beautiful. But we need to ask ourselves as a society, why do we think that's beautiful? Why do we like seeing innocent people suffering, you know? And can we sort of write stories which maybe ask a different question.
If I may just add a little bit, one thing to that. I don't think innocence is a crime, but I think a great many of the things that pass off as innocence are crimes. Ignorance, intransigence, idiocy, opinionatedness, jadedness. Take Gatsby, right? Great Gatsby, everyone loves it. Daisy, hate her. She is supposed to be innocent, but she's irritating. So I think innocence in its purest form, in its, most romantic form, is something that is quite elusive in today's day and age.
Thank you so much for that. Do we have other questions? This one there. And one at the front as well.
Hello. I don't know my question is relevant or not, but when you write a crime scene, you put some innovative idea or something. Had it ever come to your mind that it could be a precursor to a real crime, or I am giving an innovative idea to some criminal or anything like that?
Copycat murders, interesting.
About 2 years ago, I was doing a workshop with 9-year-olds in Bombay, in a school, a very well-known school, a very expensive school. And this little girl stood up and she told me that if my mother was to murder my father, how could she get away with it? Since you're a crime writer, can you tell me? I was quite scared, and I asked the teacher afterwards that, is this young lady insane? Is there stuff going on at home? What's the MacGuffin here? What am I missing? And essentially, she said, no, she's just very imaginative. 7 months later, the mother called me up and said, so my daughter, who's 9 years old, has written a mystery novel. And she sent it to me, and it was terrible. I mean, this girl will be a good writer in her 20s or her 30s. It was a bad book, but the sheer range of imagination there was unparalleled. And I think, to answer your question, and I don't know if my answer is relevant to your question, but what I can say is, there are only like 7 stories, right? At least that's what they say. Yeah. And all we are doing is we are trying to find new ways to say the same thing, right? So people are going to die, people are going to commit murders. I don't think I've contributed to the crime rate in 1917 in any way, but who knows?
I'll be quick. So I live in Scotland, and so I'm part of the Scottish writers community. And my friend Natalie Jane Clark has written a novel called The Malt Whiskey Murders. And I asked her, what's your approach to writing a mystery novel? And she's saying, I'm always thinking how I can get away with it. And so she visited a whiskey distillery, and she was seeing the barrels there, and just the thought struck her, you could hide a body in one of those. So, this is the mindset of some mystery writers, and unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, it's not mine. But I think,
It's quite a great one, actually.
That's one way to get pickled.
Yeah, it's quite a great one. I mean, I quite like that. I like that, being able to see a murder everywhere you go, and you can get some frustration.
There's a mystery writer called Vish Dhamija, who I'm pretty sure is a criminal. Just for your...
Okay.
He's a friend.
All right, excellent. I know we have time for one more question, and there's the gentleman there who had his hand up.
Yeah, hi. My question is that as a writer, I'm sure there are moments when the book is flowing organically, your ideas are floating. But also, like you mentioned, Arjun, that, when you take out a specific time in a day, daily, to put in the effort to write, I'm sure there are moments when, you're trying too hard. The book is not flowing. How do you address that situation as a writer?
So the philosopher Alan Watts says this wonderful thing, play on demand. And he's speaking to artists, but also, everyone. If you can encourage that spirit of play wherever you are, it might be the most boring activity. You're folding the laundry, doing the dishes. Having that spirit of play, finding the game, I think is a wonderful approach to have. And so when I write, I try and invoke that spirit of play. Something I often say is, you can't force the words, but you can invite them. And so work is sitting at the desk and inviting the words to come. I'm still at the desk and I'm still there. I'm present, but I'm not thinking, I'm not straining, I'm waiting, I'm inviting. And it might be that I go, have a walk. It might be that I listen to some music, speak to a friend, and all of these things will inspire new ideas. In the same way that when you're looking for your keys, and maybe many people here might have this experience, the harder you look for your keys when they're lost, the more evasive they are. But it's when you go to the next room and go, I'm going to speak to my mate. Then you think, my keys were by the dishwasher. So it's that going away, which invites.
Wonderful, wonderful. More from you on inviting your muse?
So I don't believe in the divine flow of I used to. I'm nearly 50 and I'm a bit of a cynic now. I think we make it difficult for ourselves.
Good, thanks.
I think the story, if there is such a thing as the divine story, it could be the muses, Mnemosyne reaching down from the heavens and giving us these words. But I do think that if there is a story, we are the conduit through which the story tells itself. When you start trying to impose yourself on the story, that's when you run. Writer's block is a very real thing. I have a novel I started when I was Anatomy of Loss, which was mentioned. I wrote it when I was 21. It took me almost 22 years to actually get it in a form which was worth publishing. But what Chris said is very true. You have to sit down, do other things, take notes. I'm a copious note taker. I carry a notebook. I carry a pen. Take notes. Read. It's astonishing. Sorry, time up. But I think we ended on a very good word. Read.
Read.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. No, that's wonderful. I think that's all we have time for today. But it was really wonderful, and I'm sure we'll be chatting about this later as well. You can catch them and ask them more questions if you want. I'm sure there are more in the audience. It's been really lovely, and thank you for being a lovely audience.